Hello everyone, welcome to another Incarnate live stream. Hey, today we're covering the top 10 city map fails. That's going to be the 10 most common mistakes that I see users make when working with the Watercolor Cities style. Well, let's not waste any time, let's get cracking. Coming in hot with number 10, and that's going to be stamp scale inconsistency. This happens when you generally don't set your scale right off the bat when you're working on your map. This is a common problem among all map styles. And as you can see on the map here, that you have some stamps that are a little too big in comparison to the other ones. Now, this is okay if you're trying to determine that, hey, these stamps are higher up in elevation, but you can tell that the line work is so much thicker and it looks a little off. So right away, set your scale first, and then you can kind of change it a little bit here and there. It's not an ironclad rule, but you generally want to keep the scale close to each other, whether it's a little below, a little above, a little off, that's fine. So I would just scale down these castles or castle settlement pieces right here because they look a little too big. So I'll just try to find those pieces and then we'll scale them down to the right size. That would be kind of helpful. If I can find it. So I'm selecting all of these fortifications right here, and we're going to scale them down a little bit because they just are way too big, and try to keep them within relative scale. You can keep them a little bit, like I said, you can scale them up a little bit bigger to show that it's a little higher up in elevation, and that's fine, but don't blow it up too small. That line work gets really thick and it looks really wonky. So right away, what you do is you set your scale before you get started working on your map. Otherwise, it doesn't really work out that well. So you have to make sure that you start with scale first. But when you put down your first stamp, really that's going to determine your scale. So it's a common mistake. Heyo, how's it going? Awesome, glad people are here. Let's go in with number 9, and that's going to be texture scale inconsistency. It's the same problem, only with textures or colors or whatever you might be using. And so if you're using a texture and you've set the stamp scale to like maybe 60, then you might want to change the texture scale also to 60. An example on the map is you can see here that this bridge right here, it kind of looks like the stone is much larger than what you see on this side of the map. So we have to go in then and kind of grab the proper size, because here it's too big down. So you have to scale down. It's just a rule of thumb that you should do, and you kind of get the right size better. There we go. And then you can bring down the opacity and keep that softness up, and then it will kind of blend a little bit easier in like this. So just make sure that your textures, let's say you're making some crops or you want some debris from some rocks, whatever it is you might be doing, make sure that the scale is the same as the stamps or relatively close to each other. This happens a lot. Hey, how's it going, iWhite? Glad to see you. All right, hey, let's go with number 8. No crops. So general, as a rule of thumb, the larger the city is, the larger the settlement, whatever it might be, that means there's going to be more food, and crops is generally the best way. And what I normally do is that as you're making your city and you kind of realize, well, what are these people eating, right? Is it near a water source for fish? If it's going to be some land, then make it crops. And what I like to do is that once I finish the map, you can always expand it with the resize tool. It's over in that grid. You'll see resize map. Just go ahead and use that resize feature. You start, you click, hold, drag, and you can decide how much bigger you want your canvas to be. And so it's great to resize it, and then you can just add some crops around the outside of the city. It's usually outside of the walls, though. Maybe you have some private crops inside the city that belong to maybe more wealthy merchants or maybe elite, but crops are a must do. The way that I go about doing crops, and this is a really easy method, is what I do is I'll line an area with a stamp of my choice. So I might select maybe some bushes, and I'll line an area with bushes first. So that way the crop is surrounded. You could use hedges, you could use trees, whatever it is you want to do. And then I would go in and then pick a texture of my choice for crops. So let's just pick this one. And of course, it's always good to rotate your stamp so that the crops aren't facing the exact same way. And really, depending, your crop's striations will really determine or dependent upon where your light source is. So when you're laying down your crops, make sure that that's got the maximum lighting as possible. So you'll do the striations in a direction where there's the most exposure to light. So I'll just go in and go to your advanced settings. You go to placement, rotate, and just make sure the rotation is right and always right. Resize it down. That was our previous one. Resize it, and then just go in, make sure it's set to the right layer, and just paint in your crop. Rotate a couple if you feel, put different types of crops. And what's really nice is that because you're using the bushes as kind of a guide where to fill in, it kind of helps you out. It goes quick. So you just lay down the overall outline of the crop with some bushes or whatever your stamp of choice is, and then fill it in with the crop of your choice. And just remember to scale and rotate so they kind of look right. Make sure they kind of line up with either one of the edges of the crop of the bushes or whatever that stamp might be. So crops, absolute must. They're easy to put together. You can do it last in the process if you want. That's fine, because you might not have enough room at first. Just resize, add crops outside of it. Let's go with that next step. We'll go with number 7, and that's going to be no water source. Look, whenever you have a civilization, any kind of settlement, it needs to be near a water source. It doesn't matter if it's the ocean, a lake, a river, a mangrove, whatever it might be, being near a water source. Every species needs to drink. They need to be near water for crops to drink, whatever it might be. So always include somewhere in your map some kind of water source. If you don't want it to be near a big body of water, let's say that it's a desert, then guess what? Throw in a couple wells, throw in a hidden crevice with some water in it or something like that, a sietch or whatever. So always remember to add some kind of water source. Doesn't matter what it is, throw it in somewhere. Wells are a great one if there's not an abundant water source nearby, because people need to drill down or go down into the ground to tap those underwater reserves, those underground subterranean aquifers. All right, let's go to the next one. Number 6. It's a lack of access. But when I mean access, I mean roads, bridges, staircases, whatever it might be. It's easy to kind of forget that your roads need to have kind of clear-cut roads. And normally what I do to kind of help me with whatever road problem is I try to use a path that kind of shows like the main route that might lead to somewhere. And then you would create the branching routes off of the main route. So if you're kind of confused on how to put together roads, it's not complex. It's just leading access to the important locations. Roads also create different kinds of districts. You can use walls for that as well. But just creating a path or a road system that gives access to the various districts, that goes to the main centerpiece. That centerpiece is going to be this castle right here. So the main route is going to be whatever leads to the castle, and then all the offshooting branches. So putting down roads or access is not complex. Access also includes bridges. There's a bridge right here. Notice that there's some staircases right here leading to a different part like that. Make sure maybe you want to have a staircase right here, a natural one that leads down to that farmland below. Okay, so access is super important. Make sure that the roads lead to places. Dead ends are fine, but make sure that the roads lead to access to the important parts of your city, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's going to be any of those things. It's going to be super important. So just make sure that you do all that stuff. Okay, let's go on to the next one, number 5. Flat stamps. Now, it's okay if your stamps are kind of flat. If you're going for a map style where you're not worried about trying to emphasize depth or show that your stamps kind of pop out, that's okay, because it's a watercolor city style. It doesn't have to have the same feeling that maybe a watercolor battle map might have, or a fantasy battle map might have. So it's okay if it doesn't have any kind of shadowing or anything to make them pop out. It's okay if the map looks flat. But for those of you who are like, how do I make my structures pop out? This one is not complex. You really just need to set every object or every building to layer shadow. So I'll show you how to do that. So let's go open up maybe one of these districts, and we'll select all the stamps in there. And you go to your shadow go to the right, go to the left panel, select layer. It's going to be the third option down. And now if you don't know how to edit your layer, the layer option, you can click this global layer shadow right here. This will also do that, or you can go to scene settings on the right side and you can select your global layer shadows. These are really, really helpful because layer shadows mean that any stamp that's set to layer will have that exact same shadow option, and that's great. So what we'll do is I'll go ahead and move this out of to the side, and you can see what happens when I edit the layer. But I'll maybe increase the intensity. And you notice that as the stamps, every stamp that has that gets a little bit darker, you notice that it starts to pop out a little bit more. Now there's obviously too much intensity, so decide for yourself how much intensity you want. And you can also play with the horizontal and vertical offsets if you want to kind of play with the directional shadow. Just remember that you have to make sure that it's not too far off because shadows can get disconnected. See what happens? Some of the shadows are just completely disconnected from the stamp. So just don't do that, okay? But layer shadows are fantastic. It allows a lot of stamps to have a shadow without having to edit every single one of those shadows. And it's a really good option. So check out layer shadow. I'll go ahead and just bring the intensity down. I don't need it to be that much, but enough to where they pop out. You can see the big difference here between these ones right here with that shadow and then ones here with this shadow. There's quite a difference, isn't there? So remember layer shadows or object shadows if you want things to pop out. Okay, so that's kind of a good thing that you can do. It's super important. Let's go to number 4 in our options here. We're going to go to lacks depth. Now there are a couple secrets to showing more depth on your map. You know, the same problem we had earlier. We talked about stamps and shadow. What happens if you want your map to have more depth than just being flat? You can totally do that. There's tons of tricks on how to do this. One of the first ones, and probably the most easiest one, is just to set a light source down. So if you go into the catalog, just press the F key, it'll open it up, and type in light. And now if you want to access all the different light sources in Inkarnate, just click this Inkarnate tag at the top. And we're going to select a light source or a light stamp that we like. And one really good rule of thumb is things that are higher up are going to hit more sunlight because there's less things obstructing that sunlight, like a mountain or a forest or a karst or whatever might be obstructing that, right? So think about where your highest points are on your map. And I like to drop the opacity down a little bit too. Put them at layer 5. That's all the way up. And then place a light source there. Let's look at where the other high points are on the map. There's another high point here. Let's put it here. I see another high point right here. Let's put it there. And then maybe we can also drop the opacity down even further and still have a light source on some of the lower parts. Just so there's some light there. And all right away, you kind of notice that the light source already creates some contrast, showing that that's the high point. Now, there's more than just adding a light source. You might want to also include a shadow. And there's some different ways to go about doing shadows. One of the best ways I know is to use a path and to blur it. You would just change the color to pure black, the width at 5, opacity all the way at 1. Go give it the maximum shadow blur and intensity, and then maximum blur. And what this is going to do is it's going to kind of create a nice little shadow effect. And then you can just take that and apply where you want the shadow to be. Now, the trick to this one first, though, is you have to establish where the light source is. The most easiest of light sources, or the easiest type of day, is just high noon, where the light is just straight down. Not complex, but if you wanted to show some form of directional shadow, then you have to first establish where the light source is. Let's go ahead and put down a stamp and just say this is where the light source is, this boat right here, and we'll face it in the direction that the light is going. So the light source is facing that way. That's fine. Let's go ahead and take that path. That means that everything that's being obstructed would have to have some kind of shadow. So we'll add a little bit of shadow to the terrain. And this is kind of one of the more easier ways to do shadows. There's also texturing, but it's really up to you. There's the great thing about Inkarnate is there's multiple ways to do one thing. So it's kind of nice. And everyone has their own different kind of style and how they put it together. So that's really some of the quick ways to do your light and shadow work to make depth to your map. There is another method that you can also do, and that is by changing up the stamp scale. But remember, you have to plan this out. Objects that are higher up, the scale will go up, the stamp scale. Objects that are further down, the scale will go down. Now, here's the thing. If you want to show that it's really, really, really high up, the stamp scale will go up significantly. If you want to show that your stamp is, that the area you're working with is really far down, you'll bring the scale down. Let me give an example. So let's go with maybe the farmland that we have right there. Let's just say that I want it to show that this is a little bit further down. So I'll drop the size down a little bit. Let's go down maybe to 80. Just bring the stamps down. Let's say 80, that's quite a bit, okay? And now you can see there's a significant difference in the scale between these small farm buildings out here and these buildings up here, right? They're at a different scale and significantly bigger or smaller, right? Because we're trying to show depth. So just remember that trick. You can change the stamp scale, you can tweak with the stamp scale, but you can also add light and shadow, which is basically the concept of contrast, dark and light, okay? So that's easy one to do, and you don't have to do that if you don't want to, but just by looking at it, you can see that the depth has changed already just by adding some simple light stamps and some paths that have been fiddled with a little bit. Let's go on to that next one, okay? Let's go with, let's remove no district distinction. So what I mean by that is that sometimes players get kind of lost on how do I portray a different district? How do I make them different from each other? Well, there's the obvious one by just using a different stamp set. But what happens if you kind of forgot about it and you were like, well, shoot, I don't want to delete all these blocks I just made. There is a really cool trick that's going to be super helpful for you. We'll open up those districts, and I'll just pick a random one. Let's just say that I want maybe this district right here to show that it's mage or elves or something. The biggest trick is HSBC. You go to advanced settings in the left panel, go to that hue slider, and just click randomly on the hue slider to kind of change it up. Okay, and you can see that you've got different colors. And this kind of makes it look like, hey, these are different districts. This is the quickest way and the easiest way for you to kind of fix that, oh, hey, I made this whole city but forgot to kind of change up some stamp diversity. Don't worry about that. HSBC, and that will kind of make districts right away look different and distinct from each other without having to delete and then add more stamps. So nice trick is to do that. And remember, districts are also determined by the roads or maybe walls that maybe are around them. So think about those things as well. Let's go with number 2. Number 2 is a lack of vegetation. This one happens all the time, and what happens is that vegetation is what kind of gives a city a more natural and realistic feel to it. There's always some kind of vegetation floating around. And there's multiple ways that you can go about adding vegetation to your city. Really, one of the most simplest ones is just using, let's go ahead and change up this, is to line your trees or line your roads with, let's say, some kind of plant life of some kind. So notice here that I've got some bushes lining the road. That's a great way to show vegetation. Another thing that you can do that's really, really nice is to throw in some trees. And you can even have the trees overlapping on top of the building itself to show some depth. Overlapping of stamps is another way to show depth. So, and then another great way to show vegetation is to show gardens. And a lot of stamps, like this big block right here, there's a lot of these block stamps that we have, which are a great way to fill up, to create a larger block. These are called perimeter blocks because it creates a perimeter and then a courtyard in the center of it. So you notice there's an open space in the center. That's a courtyard. And what's really nice to do with these courtyards is to paint them in and make a little garden inside of it. You could take whatever texture you want and maybe fill it in. You could throw in maybe a bush in there somewhere, or a tree, maybe a colorful kind of tree. There's a lot of different options. Maybe you want to put like a little a bush in the corner here. Maybe you want to line some bushes along the wall here. Okay, so adding gardens, vegetation, adding those kind of things are what really help to give your city some more characters, because hey, when nature comes together with human-made buildings, it looks really, really, really nice. So just factor in gardens, factor in courtyards, things like that with those perimeter blocks. That will really, really help to make it kind of pop out, okay? All right, let's go ahead with the last kind of problem that I see users make when working with the kind of watercolor city style is there's a kind of a lack of process. And, you know, right away, a lot of these problems that you see here in the top 10 issues we've seen here, it comes from a lack of process. And the way that you kind of can fix that problem is by coming up with a process of your own to kind of follow. It's not set in stone. It's just a guide to help you out. So what I start with first is I always start with a reference first for my city, whether it's a satellite image, whether it's a fantasy image I saw on whatever image site that I like to use. Some kind of reference really, really helps your brain to kind of visualize more what you're looking for out of your map. That next one is terrain. You'll put down your terrain. Whenever you're building a map, always build from the ground up. So you start with terrain first, and then you would build your city upon the terrain, right? So build that terrain. Then you would lay down your roads, creating your blocks with the road system. Then you lay down your city limits. That's going to mean like a wall or whatever kind of natural defense that brings the limits of the city. So that way you know the scope and the size and the scale to use, because you know how big the city is. You want it to be a massive city, you're going to bring the scale down. So know the limits of the city. Then you'll create a centerpiece. Now you don't have to if you don't want to, but the centerpiece for this map is clearly going to be that castle you see right there, but it could be anything, a magical garden, a floating island, whatever it might be. Usually what makes a nice map is a mix between realism and fantasy. The fantasy part can be that centerpiece. Think of it as the same concept in modern times would be like the downtown area or the main place, right? The center place. Next, you're going to want to fill in those, after you've put together those roads, you'll start building in your infrastructure, your districts, you start filling in the rest with residential, and then last but not least, add in your farms and crops. This process helps me, and maybe this process will also help you, because most of those problems are going to stem from not having a process. Whether you're in a rush to try to make a bunch of maps for a client, or if you're in a rush because you have a session going on, process is going to help you to speed it up. And process is also going to help you to come up with better quality maps. So have a process to help you along the way. Well, hey, that's it. Thank you, everyone. I hope these 10 top fails here help you to kind of see what to avoid and how to fix those problems when they do arise on maps that you might already have. Go back and just kind of fix those, okay? Thank you so much for watching. Glad I kept it short. And I will see you all next Wednesday for the next stream. Please stay safe and healthy, and I will see you soon. Auf Wiedersehen, everyone.